Good afternoon and welcome to the Mirror's Facebook Live with me, Emmeline Saunders. And today I'm joined by the lovely Laura Beil, who is the host of the Dr Death podcast. And welcome, Laura.
Thank you.
So good to have you with us. I'm really interested in getting all into this juicy story. So to throw it open to you then, this is the third season of the Dr Death podcast, which you've been hosting throughout. What does this series focus on?
I mean, obviously, bad doctors, but I think in the overall theme really is system failures, like in any of these instances with Christopher Dunch or Dr. Fata or Dr. Macchiarini. I mean, these were obviously men who did terrible things to their patients, but I think also it wouldn't have happened if there weren't a system in place that allowed it to happen, because there were people who were trying to stop it in all these cases and had difficulty.
And season 3 of the podcast, as you just mentioned, goes into the story of Dr. Macchia, and forgive me my pronunciation here, Macchiarini, who was the world famous surgeon who came up with the patented technique of artificial tracheas. Is that right?
Yes. So he said he came up with a system to put in artificial tracheas grown in the laboratory, biosynthetic tracheas. Yeah, there you go.
There they are. Yeah.
And it was groundbreaking at the time, and it really kind of seemed like the stuff of science fiction, because you could just take this trachea and grow it in the lab, put it into a patient, and the reason it sounded like science fiction is because it turned out that he hadn't done any testing on these, as he said, and of course they were not ready to be implanted into humans, and all of his patients died.
And the incredible thing is that this wasn't 50, 60 years ago. This was incredibly recent, wasn't it?
Right. It was, golly, I believe he did the first one in 2011. Oh, I can't say for sure, but
yeah, so 10 years ago.
Yeah, and yeah, and at the time he got a lot of great news coverage about this new groundbreaking technology. He was, and the other thing, part of the story is, of course, he was at a very famous institution. He was at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, which is a very renowned place to be. So he had behind him not only his own reputation, but the reputation of this really world famous institution.
And yet there seems to have been very little in the way of checks and balances on his work. Like you say, there was no kind of laboratory work or like any sort of body of evidence behind him before he started experimenting, essentially.
Right. Of course, they didn't know that. I mean, he lied about a lot of things. But the other thing is, once there were whistleblowers who tried to point out, yes, we don't think what he's doing is actually real. Extraordinarily, they went after the whistleblowers instead of him.
Right. And that's something that again crops up time and time again, doesn't it? Wherever we see these kind of industry-wide failures of checks and balances, it tends to be the cover-up, and then the whistleblowers get punished. So what happened with in this man's case? How did he get caught out?
Well, he was investigated by Karolinska, and then they let him go. They determined that he didn't, what he did wasn't criminal. So the first investigation, he sort of got off. And then, thanks to the work of some really great investigative journalists in Sweden, there was a documentary that came on television about him in Stockholm, and really detailed a lot of what he did. The journalists tried to track down his patients, and that's when they discovered these terrible outcomes of all his patients, and that he hadn't tested it. And so after that documentary aired, then they reopened the investigation into him.
And the victims you talked about, I mean, they at no point did they, or were they able to say, I think the synthetic windpipe that's been put in is failing? Were they just completely oblivious to it until it kind of did fail?
Well, they knew that they were incredibly sick. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if they could. I don't think they couldn't have known the degree of failure, because a lot of these catastrophic failures of the implant itself were discovered on autopsy. So
Right.
I don't think they could have known, but they certainly knew. These people were incredibly sick. I mean, there's one woman in the podcast who had multiple surgeries. I mean, she was in pain. You know, these are terrible, terrible thing to do to these patients.
Absolutely awful. And I just want to say to anyone out there who's listening to this, please do ask your questions in the comments below, because Laura and I would love to hear from your thoughts as well. So with Dr. Macchiarini, something very interesting happened as well, didn't it, when somebody from a documentary was sent to investigate him?
Right. So then the documentary, he welcomed this journalist in, he talked to him. He definitely, you know, he was happy to have the press. He loved getting press, actually. And so I think one of the great moments in the documentary was they discovered some footage where he was talking on a microphone. He took a phone call. He was filming the documentary, a German documentary. He took a phone call, didn't realize his microphone was still on, and he was talking about the failure of this trachea, and it was caught on the film of the German documentary. And I think that was a real turning point for the journalist. Now, this hadn't aired in Germany, but the Swedish journalists had gotten the tape of that, you know, the tape of that, and went through, and they discovered that he was basically admitting that this wasn't working, and yet kept putting it into patients.
That's absolutely unbelievable. And what I was going to ask you is, there was also so he was obviously lying in his professional life, but he was also lying in his personal life too, wasn't he?
Oh yes, but the Benita story, yes, that's yeah. So he also, there was a documentary here in the United States, and a journalist for NBC, a program called Dateline, was working on it, and she got to know him and developed a romantic relationship with him at the same time. And of course, that's not, you know, journalistically, you know, she's a very smart, ethical journalist. I think she was just at a vulnerable time in her life, and he was quite charming. And she, after the documentary aired, then she started a romance with him, and that's another kind of twin part of the narrative, is the lies that he told to her about his personal life as well. And they got to be pretty extraordinary.
They really were like whoppers, weren't they? Because he had proposed marriage to her, is that correct?
And yes, and he was Catholic, but they were both, you know, previously married. So, you know, getting married in the Catholic Church might have been an issue, but he said, "Oh, of course not. You know, I know the Pope." And then he told her that the Pope was going to perform the marriage, and it was, you know, it got to be, and there were all these celebrities who were going to be at the wedding. And of course, all of it was a lie. So he lied to his colleagues, and he lied to, you know, to her as well.
It's just absolutely incredible, isn't it? And the picture that we're showing just now is of Benita Alexander, who was his lover, yes, and also incredible investigative journalist who just got swept along with the lies and so on. And yes, it turned out that he was married to his first wife,
and had a family, and had like a family at the time that she knew of some other, like a previous marriage, but this was another. She went to Barcelona, I believe it was, and discovered like a whole other family that he had.
Wow. And do you speak to Benita in the podcast?
Yes. So the last episode, after the podcast is over, the final episode is a conversation that I had with Benita, and now she's kind of making it her mission to try to stop, you know, this from happening, to expose him. And you know, women are conned, unfortunately, by charming men all over, and so she's trying to, you know, she's using her story. I mean, she has a lot of courage to me. She could have just, you know, crawled into a hole, wanted to be done with it, and gone off, and yet she's kind of taking what happened to her and trying to use it to help other people.
Yeah, very, very courageous.
And I admire that.
Definitely, yeah. And so we come on to what actually happened to Dr. Macchiarini after he was exposed, after all of the investigations into him. So you said he actually managed to dodge the first one because he just got away with it. But there was a criminal case against him, wasn't there?
So recently he has been indicted. So they reopened the case. He has been indicted. But last I heard, and I could be wrong about this because I haven't checked recently, but at the time that we finished the podcast, it's unclear where he was. Our producers tried to find him. They had people in Italy trying to find him, and it's not really clear what's happened to him or where he is.
Just unbelievable story, isn't it? Because this is a multi-millionaire, world-famous surgeon who conned the world and has now gone to ground. Just
yes. And that's the latest information I have. Now, if anybody else knows anything, you can know. But that's I did check, and last I saw, he is not. He's not in a Swedish jail. Last I checked.
So if anyone out there knows where he is,
that's right. If you know the whereabouts of him, please let someone know, because we tried to find him.
So as I said earlier, this is the third series of the podcast. Have you got a fourth series coming out as well?
It's nothing I can talk about. I don't have anything planned, but you never know what might happen.
Yeah. So what happens next after you've done this incredible research into this man? What do you do with your time after this? Because I can see myself going down a rabbit hole and never coming out.
Yeah. It's not time off for me. I'm actually working on another project, which I can't talk about right now, but it should be out at the first of the year.
Intriguing.
Yeah. Well, no, it's not. I have not been sitting back with my feet on my desk eating chocolates. Oh, that sounds really great.
It does sound good, yeah. Well, thank you so much, Laura. I think we'll wrap it up there, because I think if you're watching this Facebook Live, we're having a few issues with Facebook at the moment, but please do get in touch with us if you do have questions for Laura after this, and I'm sure she'll be around on social media to point you in the right direction to her podcast.
Yeah, you can. If you have a question, you can tweet at me. I'll answer.
Amazing. And how do we listen to the podcast, Laura?
Anywhere there are podcasts. I mean, Apple Podcasts or any, I think any podcast platform. And you could also, I'll just give a plug for the Wondery app, because that's what I like, because if you have the Wondery app, then you can listen to everything. You don't have to have ads. And the best thing, because I tend to listen to these when I'm driving, is it just automatically goes to the next episode. So you don't have to stop and, go back, next episode. It just automatically feeds it as one continuous stream, which I happen to like.
Perfect. Well, there you go. Dr. Death podcast host Laura Beil and I. Thank you so much for joining us today. And
thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Laura. Bye.